Before America became a nation, before borders were drawn, a people ruled the deserts with silence, strategy, and unbreakable spirit. The Apache were not just desert warriors from Western films, but a diverse group of Athabascan-speaking peoples whose origins trace back to ancient migrations from the north into the American Southwest, where they developed rich spiritual traditions, complex social structures, and a way of life perfectly adapted to harsh desert and mountain environments. They lived in mobile bands tied together by kinship, shared language and ceremony, seeing the land not as empty wilderness, but as a living network of sacred places, stories, and responsibilities. Their reputation as fierce fighters grew from a deeper foundation of community, spirituality, and survival knowledge that allowed them to endure in some of the most challenging landscapes on the continent. Their history continues to symbolize resistance and cultural identity because the Apache confronted, in succession, Spanish, Mexican, and American expansion without ever fully surrendering their sense of who they were. Forced removals, imprisonment, and reservation life tried to break their autonomy, yet Apache communities preserved language, ceremony, and memory through generations of trauma. Today, the Apache story speaks not only to warfare and resistance, but to continuity, the survival of a people who refuse to disappear, who still fight for land, rights, and cultural revival, and whose real past is far more powerful than the stereotypes created for cinema. If you want to follow this journey through the true history of the Apache, beyond Hollywood myth, into the real lives, battles, and beliefs that shape them, subscribe to support the channel, leave a like so this story reaches more people, and comment which city you're watching from. The red deserts they once crossed on foot now connect to wherever you are. The story of Apache origins begins far from the red deserts that would one day define them in the popular imagination. Linguistic and archaeological evidence links the Apache to Athabascan-speaking peoples who migrated south from regions near what is now Western Canada and Alaska, moving over centuries down the spine of the Rockies into the American Southwest. These migrations did not happen overnight or as a single wave. Small groups gradually pushed into new ecological zones, pine forests, high plateaus, river valleys, adapting their tools, shelters, and diets as they went. Over time, what had once been northern forest peoples transformed into desert and mountain specialists, distinct from both their northern relatives and their new pueblo and plains neighbors. As they expanded into the southwest, Apache bands spread across a huge area that would eventually include parts of present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Chihuahua, Sonora, and beyond. Their movement followed game, water sources, and seasonal opportunities rather than fixed borders. Some groups favored higher, cooler mountain ranges as base territories, descending into valleys to hunt and raid. Others spent more time in open desert country, developing deep knowledge of scarce springs and hidden canyons. This mobility allowed them to exploit a wide environmental range while avoiding prolonged direct conflict with more sedentary peoples, at least at first. The Southwest did not become Apache land in a single conquest, but through a long process of presence, negotiation, trade, intermarriage, and at times, violent competition. Adapting to the arid and often unforgiving climate of the Southwest demanded practical genius. Apache bands learned which plants provided water and calories in drought, which roots and bulbs could be dug in lean times, and how to track animals across rocky ground where footprints were elusive. They developed lightweight, easily assembled shelters such as wickiups and teepees that could be broken down quickly and carried to new camps, minimizing dependence on any one place. Knowledge of where to find water, hidden springs, intermittent streams, seasonal pools, was guarded and passed down through story and instruction. In a land where one wrong decision could mean death from thirst, survival itself became a kind of quiet mastery over the desert. The initial social structure of Apache communities reflected this mobile, risk-balanced way of life. Rather than a centralized tribe with a rigid hierarchy, they organized in extended family bands linked by kinship, marriage, and alliance. Leadership was situational and earned. Respected men, sometimes women, who showed wisdom, generosity, and proven ability in war or diplomacy emerged as headmen, but their authority depended on persuasion, not coercion. If a leader lost trust, families could simply move on and join another band. This flexibility made Apache society resilient. Power remained distributed, decisions required consensus, and no single collapse could annihilate the people as a whole. From the beginning, the Apache relationship to the land was more than practical. It was spiritual. Mountains, rivers, canyons, and even specific rock formations held stories, taboos, and sacred meaning. Certain peaks were associated with emergence myths. Particular springs or caves became sites for ceremony and vision-seeking. The land was not empty wilderness, but a living network of relatives, protectors, and witnesses. Moving through it involved obligations as well as opportunities. Prayers, offerings, and ritual observances acknowledged these relationships, reinforcing the sense that survival depended not only on skill and courage, but on maintaining proper balance with a world filled with unseen forces. Relations with other native peoples in the region were complex and varied. The Apache traded with Pueblo communities for maize, pottery, and woven goods, exchanging hides, meat, and labor. With some neighbors, relations remained mostly peaceful and mutually beneficial for long stretches. With others, tensions over resources and territory erupted into raids and counter-raids. Over time, some Apache bands incorporated captives from other nations, while some individuals left Apache society to live among neighbors. These interactions continually reshaped identities and alliances. To label the Apache simply as raiders misses this broader mosaic of trade, intermarriage, diplomacy, and conflict that characterized the indigenous Southwest long before Europeans arrived. The earliest traditions of warfare among Apache bands evolved out of this world of shifting alliances, scarce resources, and constant risk. Raiding began as a survival strategy, stealing horses, livestock, or stored food from enemies who had previously attacked, or from wealthier, more settled communities who occupied key river valleys. War parties were small, fast, and highly selective in their targets, designed to strike and vanish rather than stand and fight. Success required stealth, endurance, and intimate knowledge of terrain. Over generations, these practices hardened into a recognizable warrior ethic: courage, cunning, loyalty to the band, and the duty to protect one's people and avenge wrongs. As centuries passed and bands adapted to specific regions, distinct Apache tribal identities emerged. The Chiricahua became closely associated with rugged mountain ranges and canyons of what is now southeastern Arizona and northern Mexico, using those natural fortresses as bases for both seasonal life and later resistance. The Mescalero centered more around southern New Mexico and West Texas, named for the mezcal agave plant that was a crucial food source. Other groups, Western Apache, Guerrilla, Lipan, and more, developed their own regional associations, dialects, and variations in custom. These weren't rigid separations, but overlapping identities. People might marry across bands, fight alongside distant cousins, and adapt practices from neighbors while still identifying strongly with a particular Apache subgroup. By the time Europeans pushed into the region, the Apache were not an emerging people, but a mature, deeply rooted presence in the Southwest, shaped by migration, hardened by climate, and knit together by kinship, ceremony, and a way of war tuned perfectly to their homeland. To outsiders, they might appear as sudden, deadly riders emerging from nowhere. But from the Apache perspective, they were at home, and it was the strangers crossing their horizons who had to explain why they were there. What happens when a people whose entire identity is built around mobility? Daily life in Apache camps was built around movement, work, and constant awareness of the land, rather than fixed villages in the European sense. Small, extended family groups gathered in seasonal camps near water, game, or plant resources, living in wickiups or teepees made from poles covered with brush, hides, or canvas. Cooking fires, grinding stones, drying racks for meat, and tools for tanning, weaving, and repairing weapons formed the core of each camp. Mornings began early, tending horses, checking the weather and tracks, preparing food, and planning the day's tasks. Life was simple in material terms, but highly organized around cooperation. Everyone had a role, from children learning to fetch water and gather wood to elders advising on routes, omens, and past experiences. Family and social roles were clear but flexible. Women managed much of the domestic economy, preparing food, making and repairing clothing, setting up and taking down shelters, and caring for young children, while also participating in trade and decision-making inside the household. Men hunted, scouted, raided, and defended the band, but also spent time with children, teaching boys horse skills, tracking and weapon use. Elders, male and female, served as storytellers, advisors, and keepers of ceremonial and historical knowledge. Leadership was not absolute. Respected headmen guided by example and persuasion rather than command. A person's worth came from reliability, bravery, generosity, and loyalty to kin, not from titles or wealth alone. Hunting traditions were central to survival and identity. Apache hunters tracked deer, antelope, elk, rabbits, and other game, learning to move silently through brush, read subtle signs on rock and soil, and use cover to approach within bow or rifle range. They also gathered wild plants, agave, mesquite beans, berries, nuts, roots, using an encyclopedic knowledge of seasons and microclimates. Hunts were often preceded by small rituals or quiet prayers, acknowledging the animal's spirit and the mutual obligation between human and prey. Successful hunters shared meat widely, reinforcing bonds within the band. Failure to share or boasting excessively over kills was frowned upon, as it threatened group harmony. The famous Apache scouts emerged later in the 19th century, when U.S. Army officers realized that the same skills which made Apache warriors such elusive opponents could also make them invaluable allies. Apache men, often from bands with rivalries against those being pursued or simply seeking survival options in a collapsing world, served as scouts for U.S. forces, guiding soldiers through terrain they did not understand, reading tracks invisible to outsiders, and predicting enemy movements. This role was controversial among Apache themselves. Some saw it as betrayal, others as adaptation, but it demonstrated how deeply their way of life had trained them to see and move through the land in ways imperial armies could not match. Sacred rituals and spiritual beliefs infused daily existence. Apache cosmology included powerful beings, sacred mountains, animals as messengers or teachers, and a sense that the world was filled with unseen forces requiring respect. Ceremonies marked life passages, girls' puberty rites, healing dances, and community rituals that called on spiritual help in times of sickness, drought, or danger. Medicine men and women, specialists in song, story, and herbal knowledge, acted as intermediaries between the human and spirit worlds. Dreams and visions could carry guidance or warnings. Unlike rigid religious systems, Apache spirituality was woven closely into practical life: how to travel, where to camp, when to avoid certain places, and how to show respect to the land and its beings. Constant mobility was not just a tactical choice, it was a core principle of Apache existence. Moving camp kept resources from being overused, reduced vulnerability to surprise attack, and allowed bands to adapt quickly to changing conditions: weather, game migrations, enemy movements. Horses, once adopted after Spanish contact, amplified this mobility dramatically, allowing faster travel, long-distance raids, and rapid dispersal if threatened. Possessions were kept light and functional because anything too heavy or bulky would slow the band's ability to vanish into the landscape. To outsiders, this mobility seemed rootless. To the Apache, it was the opposite, a way of staying rooted in a living, changing land without trying to pin it down with fences or permanent walls. Advanced survival methods grew naturally from this mobility and harsh environment. Apache people studied wind patterns, cloud shapes, and animal behavior to predict weather. They knew how to find water from subtle signs, certain plants, insect activity, or bird flight. In extreme conditions, they could travel at night, navigating by stars and landforms, resting in shade during the day to conserve water. They developed ways to move without leaving obvious tracks, stepping on rock, brushing out footprints, avoiding muddy ground. Skills that later made them legendary as both opponents and scouts. Their clothing and gear were adapted for function. Moccasins that could be repaired quickly, garments suited to both heat and cold, and packs designed for fast loading and unloading. Underlying all this was a philosophy of near absolute freedom. Apache people valued the ability to decide when and where to move, whom to follow, and how to live. No distant ruler could rightfully dictate their movements or claim the land they used. This freedom was not anarchy. It was bounded by obligations to family, band, and spiritual law. But it meant that attempts by outsiders, Spanish, Mexican, or American, to impose fixed boundaries, reservations, or forced settlements struck at the heart of Apache identity. To be confined was to be cut off from the very conditions that made them who they were. That philosophy of freedom would collide violently with expanding empires that believed land could be owned, borders fixed, and people confined for their own good. And when those empires finally came in force, first with crosses and missions, then with flags and forts, the Apache way of life, perfectly adapted to the old world, would be tested against a new one that refused to let the desert's children remain forever in motion. In Apache warfare, the ambush was not a trick, it was the core of their doctrine. War parties moved light and fast, scouting trails, waterholes, and canyons long before a fight ever happened. They chose places where enemies would be funneled into predictable routes. Narrow passes, dry washes, river crossings, then waited motionless for hours or days. The first strike came suddenly, a volley of arrows from rocks above, a charge from brush that moments before looked empty, or a cut across a column at its weakest point. The goal was not to stand and trade blows, but to hit hard, cause maximum confusion, and vanish before the enemy could reorganize. The terrain itself was their greatest ally and weapon. Apache warriors knew every ridgeline, hidden ravine, game trail, and rock shelf in their homeland. They used high ground for observation and retreat, dry riverbeds for hidden movement, and broken rock for breaking up cavalry charges. Where outsiders saw an empty desert, the Apache saw paths, cover, ambush sites, and escape routes. They could lead enemies into terrain that exhausted horses, broke formation, and denied artillery or heavy weapons any real advantage. This strategic reading of the land turned the Southwest's harshness into a protective cloak. Discretion and camouflage fed their legendary reputation. War parties traveled with minimal gear, clothing matched to rock and brush, faces and weapons dulled to avoid reflections. They moved at night or at dawn and dusk, resting during the brightest hours. They could lie flat in scrub, so low an enemy could pass within meters without seeing them. This skill extended to sound as well. They knew when not to speak, how to move without rattling gear, and how to use ambient noise, wind, rain, animal calls to mask their presence. To soldiers used to set-piece battles on open ground, Apache opponents seemed to materialize and disappear like ghosts. On the battlefield, communication relied on signals more than shouted orders. Hand signs, whistles, bird call imitations, and prearranged gestures allowed warriors to shift positions, initiate attacks, or withdraw without revealing their plans. A raised hand, a shifted posture, or a tossed stone could send a message to those watching. Everyone in a war party understood the general plan, the terrain, and their roles. so they needed few commands once fighting began. This silent coordination allowed small groups to operate with a unity that confused larger, less flexible forces. Traditional weapons and tactics were designed for speed and precision. Before widespread firearms, Apache warriors favored short bows, suitable for shooting from cover or horseback, lances and spears for close-in strikes, and knives and war clubs for final engagements. Arrows could be loosed rapidly from concealment, sometimes tipped or notched for specific effects. Hit-and-run raids exploited these tools. Ride or run in, fire quickly, grab what was needed, horses, supplies, captives, and retreat before an organized counterattack. The Apache did not seek glory in prolonged, honorable combat. Victory meant surviving and protecting the band while inflicting enough damage to deter pursuit. The introduction of firearms did not erase traditional tactics, it modified them. Apache fighters quickly adopted captured or traded rifles and pistols, integrating them into their existing style rather than copying European linear tactics. A rifle extended the reach of an ambush, allowed more lethal first strikes, and increased the psychological impact of their attacks. But ammunition was scarce and reliability low, so firearms were often reserved for key shots, an officer, a scout, a lead rider, while bows, lances, and knives remained central. The combination of old and new weapons made them even more unpredictable. Enemies never knew if a distant canyon wall hid arrows, bullets, or both. To many US and Mexican soldiers, the Apache seemed invincible, not because they couldn't be killed, but because they refused to fight in ways conventional armies understood. They avoided open-field engagements, struck supply lines instead of fortified positions, and melted back into mountains where cavalry tired and infantry broke down from heat and thirst. Every defeat taught them more about enemy tactics and vulnerabilities. Every victory against them taught their enemies how little they really knew. Reports from officers often described the frustration of chasing tracks that vanished into rock, of marching for days without sight of an opponent who had just burned a ranch or ambushed a patrol. This aura of invincibility had a psychological edge. Settlers and soldiers alike told stories of Apache raiders appearing out of nowhere, of entire parties wiped out without firing a shot, of distant shots from unseen heights. Fear magnified reality. A small band could paralyze movement across a vast area because no one knew where or when they'd strike next. That uncertainty, combined with the Apache's proven willingness to endure hardship, travel long distances, and fight on their terms, made them one of the most respected and dreaded guerrilla forces in North American history. But no matter how skilled, a people cannot live by war alone. Behind every ambush lay families, ceremonies, and a way of life rooted in freedom and movement. And as new empires pushed deeper into the Southwest with missions, forts, and flags, the Apache would discover that even the best guerrilla tactics would have to adapt again when the enemy came, not just for their warriors, but for the land itself and everything sacred upon it. The first encounters between Apache bands and the expanding Spanish Empire were not sudden collisions, but a slow, uneasy awareness that strangers were moving into lands long governed by older rhythms. Spanish explorers and missionaries pushing north from New Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries encountered mobile Athabascan-speaking groups on the fringes of their claimed territories. People the Spaniards would come to label generically as Apaches. To the newcomers, the desert and mountains looked empty and ripe for missions, ranches, and mining camps. To the Apache, these were ancestral travel routes, hunting grounds, and sacred spaces suddenly crossed by men with metal armor, guns, and a very different idea of ownership. Spanish attempts at conversion and control followed the pattern they used elsewhere in the Americas: missions, presidios, forts, and alliances with certain native groups against others. Missionaries sought to draw Apache families into fixed settlements where they could be baptized, taught Spanish, and turned into agricultural laborers, Soldiers and colonial officials pushed for reductions, concentrating scattered bands into more controllable communities. For people whose identity was built on mobility and autonomy, being confined around a church and fields felt less like salvation and more like imprisonment. Some individuals engaged with missions for trade, food, or temporary refuge, but whole Apache bands consistently resisted the idea of permanent subordination to Spanish authority. As Spanish ranches, mining operations, and supply posts pushed deeper into the northern frontier, Apache raiding intensified. These were not random acts of cruelty, but targeted strikes against outposts that symbolized occupation and provided valuable resources: horses, cattle, tools, and weapons. Apache warriors learned the routines of presidios and estancias, attacking when guards were lax, livestock scattered, or small detachments traveled between settlements. Night raids became infamous. Livestock driven off in the dark, isolated ranches burned, and defenders killed or chased away before they could organize a defense. To Spanish settlers, it felt like relentless harassment. To the Apache, it was both resistance and a necessary means of survival in a landscape increasingly carved up by outsiders. Spanish authorities responded with punitive expeditions, columns of soldiers, sometimes accompanied by indigenous allies, sent into Apache territory to punish raids and pacify hostile bands. These campaigns often failed to achieve lasting results. Apache fighters refused set-piece battles, lured troops into difficult terrain, and vanished before overwhelming force could bring them to heel. Spanish diaries and reports describe weeks of marching under brutal sun, short of water, chasing opponents who knew when to fight and when to disappear. Even when the Spanish managed to inflict casualties or destroy camps, surviving Apache bands simply dispersed and regrouped elsewhere. The structure of Apache society, decentralized, flexible, mobile, made total subjugation almost impossible. Over time, cultural changes followed contact, even amidst conflict. Spanish goods began to circulate. Metal tools, knives, cloth, and especially firearms altered Apache material culture and tactics. New trade patterns developed, sometimes through peaceful exchange, sometimes through raiding and ransom. Some Apache individuals learned Spanish and became intermediaries, scouts, or negotiators, moving between worlds. Diseases introduced by Europeans also took a toll, thinning populations and forcing bands to adapt socially and demographically. The relationship was not one-way adoption. Apache people selectively incorporated what served their needs while rejecting attempts to erase their way of life. The horse, introduced and spread by the Spanish, became one of the most transformative elements of this era. Initially a symbol of Spanish military and social power, horses captured in raids or obtained through trade quickly became central to Apache mobility and warfare. Mounted Apache raiders could travel farther and faster, strike deeper into enemy territory, and escape pursuers more effectively. Horses also expanded hunting capacity and the ability to move family camps across larger distances. The Spanish had unintentionally armed their opponents with one of the most potent tools of resistance, turning Apache warriors into some of the most formidable light cavalry in the region. In this environment, war became less an occasional event and more a recurring mechanism for survival. As Spanish settlements disrupted traditional resource patterns and enclosed more land, raiding filled the gaps left by lost hunting grounds and blocked migration routes. Fighting was about more than honor or revenge. It was a way to secure food, horses, weapons, and leverage in a changing power landscape. Young men proved themselves in raids. Bands measured leaders by their skill in conflict and negotiation, and entire communities organized around being able to move, hide, and strike under constant pressure. The Spanish, in turn, began to circulate stories about the Apaches that exaggerated their savagery, but also acknowledged their effectiveness. Frontier settlers spoke of them as relentless raiders, impossible to subdue, masters of a harsh land that seemed to betray outsiders while sheltering its indigenous defenders. Reports traveled back to colonial centers and even to Europe. Tales of desert warriors who could not be pinned down, who struck without warning and melted into mountains no army could conquer. The Apache reputation, part truth, part fear, part propaganda, began to take shape in the wider world. Yet this was only the first empire the Apache would confront. The Spanish might have claimed the land with crosses and royal decrees, but their actual control remained patchy, fragile, and vulnerable to the very guerrilla tactics Apache bands had perfected. A more relentless wave was coming, one that brought not just missions and presidios, but fences, railroads, and a belief that every inch of land had to be surveyed, owned, and controlled. When that next wave arrived from the east, the Apache would discover that their long war with the Spanish had been only the rise of the great Apache war leaders was not a sudden explosion of heroism, but the product of generations of conflict, adaptation, and hard choices. As pressure from Spain, then Mexico, and rival native groups increased, certain men emerged whose judgment, charisma, and skill in both diplomacy and war made them focal points for scattered bands. Leaders like Mangus Coloradus, Cochise, Victorio, Ju, and later Geronimo did not rule in the European sense. They persuaded. Their authority rested on reputation. Success in raids, fairness in dividing spoils, courage under fire, and the ability to hold families together in crisis. A leader who failed his people could be left behind as families drifted to follow someone more capable. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, Apache territorial presence expanded and shifted in response to opportunity and threat. Horse culture and firearms allowed war parties to travel farther, raiding deep into Spanish, then Mexican northern provinces and across the plains. Chiricahua power grew around the rugged ranges of southeastern Arizona and northern Mexico. Mescalero influence stretched across southern New Mexico and West Texas. Lipan and other groups pushed into the southern plains. Apache territory was never a fixed map, but a living zone of movement. Trails, waterholes, hiding places, and seasonal ranges that, taken together, gave them reach over an enormous area. To outsiders, it seemed as if Apache country could be anywhere their scouts or raiders appeared. Inside this world, alliances and rivalries constantly reshaped power. Some Apache bands cooperated closely, sharing intelligence, warriors, and refuge. Others held grudges over past slights, disputes over stolen horses, or disagreements about dealing with outsiders. Relationships with neighboring native nations, Pueblo, Navajo, Comanche, Ute, O'odham, and others, ranged from trade and intermarriage to bitter enmity. A wise leader had to manage not just war against foreign empires, but diplomacy inside a complex indigenous landscape. One misjudged raid or broken promise could turn potential allies into new enemies, shrinking the spaces where bands could move or hide. Warfare tactics continued to sharpen under this pressure. War leaders refined raiding into a sophisticated art, scouting trails weeks in advance, coordinating multiple small groups, and timing attacks around moon phases, weather, and enemy routines. They learned which forts were too strong to bother with, and which ranches or caravans were vulnerable. Some leaders emphasized surgical strikes, short, precise raids that minimized risk while delivering clear messages. Others favored bolder operations that carried higher danger but greater reward. Over time, knowledge shared through councils and campfire stories created a body of tactical wisdom inherited by each new generation of warriors. Traditional enemies, Spanish and later Mexican settlements, rival native raiders, and occasionally U.S. traders or military units felt the impact of these perfected tactics in waves of raids. Apache warriors targeted horse herds, supply trains, remote outposts, and isolated ranches, striking where defenses were weakest. Successful raids brought back not only material goods, but also status. Young men who proved themselves under fire gained prestige and a voice in councils. Older warriors reinforced their reputations by planning and executing difficult missions. Raiding was never just theft, it was woven into the fabric of survival, identity, and intergroup politics. As stories of these warriors spread, carried by frightened settlers, frustrated soldiers, and awed indigenous neighbors, the legend of the Apache took on a life of its own. They became, in the minds of outsiders, the archetype of the desert fighter, tireless, ruthless, impossible to track or defeat. Mexican reports spoke of parties wiped out with no survivors. U.S. cavalry officers wrote home about chasing shadows that struck and vanished. Each encounter, each narrow escape, each devastating ambush added another layer to a reputation that sometimes outpaced reality. Fear did part of the work that bullets and arrows could not. It discouraged encroachment into certain areas and made authorities think twice before sending small detachments into known Apache country. Inside Apache society, warrior honor became more explicitly codified as conflict intensified. Bravery in battle, loyalty to the band, and refusal to abandon comrades under fire were praised in stories, songs, and the quiet judgments of elders. A man who boasted falsely, endangered others through recklessness, or failed to share properly after raids could find his status eroded quickly. By contrast, those who showed restraint, who refused to kill unnecessarily, who brought back captives alive when it served diplomatic purposes, were often judged more favorably than pure bloodshed alone would warrant. Honor was not mindless violence. It was courage under a moral code defined by obligation to kin, respect for capable enemies, and endurance in the face of impossible odds. Yet, as Apache warriors reached the height of their fearsome reputation, larger threats were converging. The collapse of Spanish authority and the rise of independent Mexico did not bring peace. It brought new, often more chaotic enemies. Mexican militias and bounty systems sometimes paid for Apache scalps, escalating cycles of atrocity. At the same time, from the east, a new force advanced, one with more people, more soldiers, and a very different vision of land. The United States, fresh from continental expansionist dreams and armed with industrial capacity, railroads, and a belief in manifest destiny, began to move into the same deserts the Apache had mastered for generations. The stage was set for a new and final phase of conflict, one in which even the most skilled guerrilla fighters would find themselves outnumbered, outgunned, and pursued by an enemy that could replace every lost soldier and extend its reach ever deeper into the Red Desert. And in that crucible, one Apache leader's name would rise above all the others, turning into a symbol both of defiance and of the end of an era. When American settlers began pushing west in large numbers during the 19th century, the Apache world, already strained by centuries of Spanish and Mexican pressure, faced its most relentless wave of intrusion. Settlers followed wagon trails, stage routes, and later railroads into lands the Apache had moved through freely for generations, fencing pastures, digging mines, and founding towns in valleys and along water sources that were vital to survival in the desert. What to a homesteader looked like empty land, waiting for farms and ranches, was to the Apache a living map of campsites, sacred places, hunting grounds, and routes of escape. Each new cabin or corral was not just a structure, it was a sign that the world was being permanently narrowed. This expansion cut directly into areas the Apache regarded as spiritually charged. Mountains that anchored origin stories, springs associated with healing or vision quests, and secluded canyons used for ceremonies suddenly lay near or within American claims. Soldiers and surveyors treated these features as landmarks for mapping and fort construction, while prospectors saw them only as obstacles or resources. Apache people saw outsiders camping where their ancestors were buried, blasting rock near sacred cliffs, and diverting water from springs that held deep ritual meaning. Desecration wasn't always intentional. Americans often had no idea what they were violating, but ignorance offered no comfort. From Apache eyes, it was an attack on the balance between people, land, and spirit. Territorial disputes became inevitable as American maps turned Apache homelands into numbered plots and legal parcels. The U.S., Government negotiated treaties defining boundaries and promising autonomy or protection, but these agreements usually reflected American concepts of fixed borders, not Apache understandings of seasonal movement and shared use. Bands that had long rotated between mountain and desert camps found certain zones suddenly declared off-limits because they now belonged to settlers, railroads, or mining companies. When Apache families continued to use these areas as they always had, conflicts flared, grazing disputes, accusations of theft, and retaliatory attacks on both sides. Competition over natural resources intensified these tensions. Cattle ranching consumed grasslands and water sources on which wild game and Apache horses depended. Mining operations polluted streams and drew in large workforces who needed supplies and protection, bringing more soldiers and armed civilians into Apache space. Timber cutting in mountain areas removed cover and altered ecosystems. Each new enterprise chipped away at the ecological base that supported Apache mobility and hunting. Where they once could relocate to avoid conflict, they increasingly found themselves penned between expanding settlements, rival tribes pushed by U.S. policy, and military posts built to secure the frontier. The first treaties between the United States and various Apache groups were often framed as peace agreements, promising rations, limited reserved lands, and protection from other enemies in exchange for an end to raiding and acceptance of U.S. authority. In practice, these treaties were frequently broken or reinterpreted unilaterally by American officials whenever land or minerals were discovered in areas previously guaranteed to Apache use. When settlers complained that a reservation area contained too much good land or blocked access to desired routes, boundaries were redrawn or agreements scrapped. For Apache leaders, each broken promise confirmed that written words from distant capitals held little weight compared to soldiers and surveyors on the ground. Cultural clashes ran deeper than land and law. Apache concepts of honor, property, justice, and freedom often collided with American notions. Raiding, for example, had long been a recognized tool of survival and retaliation in the Southwest. U.S. settlers labeled it simple criminality. Apache leaders expected face-to-face negotiation and reciprocity. American officials relied on bureaucracy and distant chains of command. Apache spiritual practices were dismissed as superstition by missionaries and agents who pushed Christianity and Euro-American schooling. The insistence that Apache children be taught English, dressed in American clothing, and educated away from traditional lifeways signaled a desire not just to control Apache bodies, but to remake their minds. As violence and mistrust grew, the U.S. military launched increasingly aggressive campaigns into Apache territory. Forts sprang up at strategic points linked by telegraph lines and supply routes that allowed quicker response to real or rumored attacks. Officers sought out Apache scouts, men whose knowledge of terrain and tracking was unmatched, to help pursue hostile bands, pitting Apache against Apache under U.S. command. Columns of cavalry, sometimes supported by allied native units, rode deep into mountain strongholds, burning crops, capturing families, and trying to force holdouts onto reservations by destroying their means of independent survival. Some officers respected Apache skill. Others saw them only as obstacles to be eliminated or tamed. This cycle of intrusion, resistance, and military reprisal escalated the violence on all sides. Raids against ranches or stage lines brought punitive expeditions that destroyed camps and killed non-combatants, fueled deep bitterness and calls for revenge. Settler militias and bounty systems normalized killing Apache people for pay or defense, blurring lines between civilian and military violence. Stories of atrocities circulated in both Apache camps and frontier towns, each side building narratives of betrayal and brutality. In such an environment, trust became nearly impossible, and even well-intentioned peace efforts struggled to overcome the weight of blood already spilled. For the Apache, the core problem was not simply that they faced a powerful enemy, but that this enemy seemed endless, Spanish garrisons could be outweighted or sidestepped. Mexican governments wavered and changed. The United States, by contrast, kept sending more settlers, more soldiers, more railroads, more laws. Every surrender seemed to be followed by new demands. Every agreement to stay on one piece of land led to pressure to move again. In this tightening vice, war leaders and spiritual figures wrestled with devastating questions. How long could they fight? What did it mean to preserve honor when every battle risked the lives of children and elders? And was there any path forward that did not end in either death or confinement? Those questions would crystallize around one name, a man whose life would come to symbolize both the brilliance of Apache resistance and the painful limits of what courage and cunning could accomplish against an empire that refused to stop coming. Geronimo was not born a legend, but as Goyaway, the one who yawns, around 1829, among the Bedonkohe band of the Chiricahua Apache. He was not originally a chief in the European sense, but a war leader and spiritual figure whose authority came from personal courage, proven power in battle, and a reputation for visions that seemed to predict danger and survival. His early life was marked by tragedy. Mexican troops attacked his camp while he was away trading, killing his mother, wife, and children. That loss burned into him, a resolve that would shape the rest of his life. A driving force behind the relentless resistance he would lead against both Mexican and later American forces. Spiritually, Geronimo occupied a role somewhere between medicine man, visionary, and war leader. He claimed that after his family was killed, a voice spoke to him, promising that no bullet would be able to kill him in battle. Stories spread among his people that he could sense ambushes, read signs others missed, and endure wounds that would have killed other men. Whether or not every story was literally true mattered less than the effect. Warriors who rode with Geronimo believed they were following someone guided by powers beyond the ordinary. That belief made them more willing to take risks, to hold out longer in desperate conditions, and to trust his judgment when everything seemed lost. His clashes with U.S. forces became the stuff of frontier legend. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, as the U.S. government pushed Apache bands onto reservations and tightened control, Geronimo repeatedly left confinement with small groups of followers, fleeing into the Sierra Madre Mountains of northern Mexico. From there, he launched raids across the border against ranches, military detachments, and supply lines. Columns of U.S. cavalry and scouts pursued him through some of the roughest terrain on the continent, often failing to catch more than glimpses or fresh tracks. Newspapers in the East turned these pursuits into serialized dramas, while in the Southwest, soldiers and settlers came to see Geronimo as the embodiment of Apache resistance. Avoiding capture required a blend of traditional knowledge and ruthless calculation. Geronimo's parties traveled light, scattered when threatened, and used deep canyons, hidden springs, and high ridges to evade larger forces. He shifted camps frequently, sent scouts ahead and behind, and sometimes split his group into small units that would reunite at predetermined locations. When pressure grew too intense on the U.S. side, he crossed into Mexico, knowing that coordination between American and Mexican forces was often slow and strained. He changed routes, doubled back on trails, and used misleading tracks to confuse pursuers. To frustrated officers, it seemed he could vanish into stone. To his followers, it proved the land still protected those who knew its secrets. The hunt for the ghost of the desert became one of the most expensive manhunts in U.S. military history. Generals deployed thousands of soldiers, Apache scouts, and allied native auxiliaries to track a band that at times numbered only a few dozen fighters, women, and children. Telegraphs carried updates. Newspapers speculated wildly about his location and intentions. Each time the army announced that Geronimo's band was cornered, he slipped away again, turning successes into embarrassments. This disproportionate struggle revealed both the effectiveness of Apache guerrilla tactics and the anxiety of an empire determined to close what it saw as the last gap in its control of the Southwest. The end came not with battlefield defeat, but with exhaustion and negotiation. In 1886, after years of pursuit and broken agreements on both sides, Geronimo surrendered to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona Territory, in what became one of the most famous surrenders in Western history. Photographs and press reports turned the scene into an iconic moment, the last major native leader in the region laying down arms. But the terms were harsher than many of his followers expected. Geronimo, his warriors, and even Apache scouts who had served the U.S. Army were shipped east as prisoners of war, far from their desert homeland, first to Florida and later to Alabama and Oklahoma. For the people who had followed him, the surrender meant not just the end of resistance, but the beginning of long captivity. In the years that followed, Geronimo transformed into a paradoxical symbol. As a prisoner, he was paraded at world's fairs and public events, selling autographs and photographs, riding in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade, and telling his story to curious Americans who now romanticized the very resistance they had crushed. He converted to Christianity, but continued to speak proudly of his past as a warrior, insisting that his fight had been for his people's survival and freedom. To many white Americans, he became a safe, contained version of the wild Indian, a living relic of a conquered era. To Apache and other native people, he remained a more complicated figure, a brave leader, a man whose choices had life or death consequences for his followers, and a reminder of how even the fiercest resistance could be boxed, displayed, and mythologized. For the Apache as a whole, the consequences of Geronimo's final stand were profound. His surrender marked the effective end of large-scale armed resistance in the Southwest and confirmed U.S. dominance over their homelands. Entire communities were uprooted and held as prisoners of war for decades, cut off from sacred places, traditional livelihoods, and the full practice of their ceremonies. Children were sent to boarding schools designed to erase their language and culture. Reservation life, rations, and imposed regulations replaced the older rhythms of movement and self-determined survival. The warrior ethos that had once centered on defending band and land had to find new expressions under watchtowers and government agents. Yet even in that confinement, the Apache's spirit of endurance did not vanish. Stories of Geronimo and other leaders were told quietly in families. Songs and rituals survived in altered form, and a new kind of resistance, cultural, spiritual, and political, began to take shape. The battlefield shifted from canyons and deserts to schools, councils, and courts, and the question hanging over the next generation was no longer how to outrun cavalry in the mountains, but how to keep being Apache in a world determined to turn them into something else. The end of open resistance did not bring peace to the Apache. It brought a different kind of war, fought against their bodies, their spirits, and their way of life. The physical impact of capture was immediate and brutal. Warriors who had spent their lives riding through deserts and mountains found themselves shackled, crowded into rail cars, and transported thousands of miles away to humid climates where disease spread fast. Many, weakened by years of pursuit and short rations, succumbed to illness in prison camps. The emotional toll was just as deep. People who had defined themselves through movement, autonomy, and intimate connection to specific landscapes woke up each day behind fences, unable to walk to the horizons that had once been theirs. Forced displacement turned entire bands into prisoners of war, sometimes for decades. After Geronimo's surrender, not only his followers, but also Apache scouts who had served the U.S. Army were shipped east as captives, a betrayal that cut deeply into the trust between Apache people and American promises. Families were split between different forts and camps in Florida, Alabama, and later Oklahoma. Some died without ever returning home. For elders, the shock of being uprooted from sacred mountains and deserts into foreign forests and swamps felt like a final severing from the spiritual anchors of their lives. Younger people, born into captivity, had to learn their own homeland almost as legend. Life on reservations, once the prisoners were relocated yet again, offered safety from open warfare, but imposed a new kind of confinement. Rations, often inadequate and poorly distributed, created dependence on government agents who controlled food, supplies, and permission to travel. Farming, pushed as a civilizing alternative, clashed with Apache traditions shaped around hunting, gathering, and mobile camps. Fixed houses and fields might protect against starvation in theory, but in practice, they were often placed on marginal land with poor soil and limited water. The reservation was a cage drawn on a map. Inside, the Apache were supposed to become something else. Outside, they were no longer welcome as themselves. The loss of territory meant more than losing hunting grounds. It meant losing sacred sites where ceremonies had always been held, mountain passes associated with origin stories, springs where prayers had been offered for generations. Without regular access to these places, many rituals had to be adapted, simplified, or performed in secret within far more limited spaces. The land had been part of the ceremonial language. Severing that connection damaged more than practical survival. It weakened the lines of memory and meaning that bound generations together. Cultural destruction did not happen only through guns and fences. It was policy. Children were taken from families and sent to boarding schools where they were punished for speaking Apache languages, forced into military-style routines, and taught that their traditions were backward or sinful. Hair was cut, names were replaced with English ones, and Christian prayers replaced traditional ones in public life. Ceremonies that once brought whole bands together had to be hidden from officials or altered to avoid punishment. Songs, stories, and ritual knowledge survived only where elders were determined enough and circumstances kind enough to keep teaching them quietly, despite pressure to stop. Assimilation programs claimed to offer a better future, but their real goal was to erase Apache identity. Government agents and missionaries pushed farming, Christianity, and English-only education as the price of survival in the new order. Traditional gender roles were challenged not in empowering ways, but through demands that men become sedentary farmers and women adopt Euro-American domestic norms. Those who resisted were labeled wild, lazy, or hostile. In this environment, simply speaking the language, making traditional clothing, or teaching children old stories became acts of quiet defiance. Despite everything, resistance persisted, not in the form of raids and ambushes, but in the stubborn preservation of identity. Families continued to pass on language around fires and kitchen tables. Some leaders agreed to work with schools and agencies while using their positions to protect what traditions they could. Others revived ceremonies in adapted forms, anchoring them to new places while invoking the memory of lost mountains and deserts. Community gatherings, dances, and storytelling sessions kept alive a sense of being Apache, even when surrounded by a world that insisted they become something else. Meanwhile, the press and popular culture turned the Apache into spectacle. Newspapers published sensational stories about savage warriors turned prisoners, often framing them as dangerous curiosities or tragic remnants of a vanished age. Illustrations and later photographs showed Geronimo and other leaders in staged poses, half warrior, half exhibit. Wild West shows hired Apache performers, paying them to reenact battles and raids, for paying audiences who cheered the dramatized version of the very conflicts that had destroyed their freedom. In print and later on screen, Apache people became symbols long before they were treated as full human beings with present tense lives and futures. Yet within and beyond the reservations, a question refused to die. Could a people whose identity had been built on movement, autonomy, and a sacred relationship to a particular land truly survive as themselves inside fences, schoolhouses, and stereotypes? Or would they be absorbed into a broader American story that used their image while burying their reality? The answer would not be found in battle reports or government orders, but in how the Apache chose to remember, rebuild, and speak for themselves in a world that preferred myth over listening. Hollywood helped freeze the image of the wild Apache in the global imagination, Bareback riders circling wagon trains, stoic warriors attacking without mercy, nameless hostiles whose sole purpose in a story was to threaten white settlers before being defeated. Western films of the mid-20th century flattened entire nations into a single stereotype: savage, relentless, doomed to vanish, rarely showing families, ceremonies, councils, or the long history of resistance to multiple empires. Even when Apaches were portrayed as brave, it was usually in ways that served someone else's hero's journey, not their own. That cinematic figure still lingers today in costumes, mascots, and tropes that say more about American fantasy than Apache reality. The myth diverges sharply from the historical record. In reality, Apache societies were politically sophisticated, spiritually rich, and militarily strategic, communities that navigated Spanish, Mexican, and US power with remarkable adaptability. They were not constantly at war. They traded, intermarried, negotiated truces, and built alliances with other native nations, and at times even with colonial forces. Their warfare was not random brutality, but a survival strategy honed over centuries, aimed at protecting their people and autonomy in a world that repeatedly tried to seize their land and erase their identity. Seeing them only as warriors obscures the farmers, singers, healers, artisans, children, and elders whose lives made that resistance possible. Culturally, the Apache story has had a global impact far beyond the Southwest. The very word Apache became shorthand in many languages for toughness, guerrilla skill, or outlaw defiance, sometimes admirably, often ignorantly. Military strategists have studied Apache hit-and-run tactics, scouts' tracking abilities, and use of terrain as early examples of effective irregular warfare. Musicians, writers, and artists worldwide have invoked Apache imagery to symbolize rebellion against larger powers. Yet this broad influence often floats free from actual Apache voices, turning them into symbols while leaving living communities fighting for land, water, language, healthcare, and recognition in the present. The real history is more profound than any myth, because it is a story of endurance as much as of resistance. It's about people who faced 3 successive empires, Spanish, Mexican, and American, and survived each, even when imprisoned, displaced, and scattered far from their homelands. It's about the quiet heroism of grandparents who kept speaking the language at home, even when schools punished their children for it, of medicine people who adapted ceremonies to new landscapes, and of young people today who reclaim songs, stories, and names nearly lost to boarding schools and forced assimilation. That depth, human, painful, resilient, offers more meaning than any simplified legend of the last warriors. The struggle for cultural preservation remains central. Apache nations work to revitalize languages, protect sacred sites from mining and development, and teach younger generations about traditional lifeways alongside modern education. Cultural centers, language immersion programs, and community-led projects document oral histories and ceremonies with care and consent. Legal battles continue over land rights, water access, and religious freedom, especially around mountains and springs long recognized as holy. Each victory, however partial, pushes back against centuries of erasure and asserts that Apache identity is not a relic but a living, evolving reality. Modern Apache leaders, tribal chairs, activists, educators, artists, and spiritual authorities play crucial roles in this revival. Some negotiate with federal and state governments for resources and recognition. Others focus on healing intergenerational trauma through culture, ceremony, and mental health work. Youth organizers bring Apache issues into digital spaces, connecting local struggles to global indigenous movements. These leaders do what earlier war chiefs did in different conditions: protect their people, adapt strategies to new threats, and insist that Apache voices must define Apache futures. Today, Apache communities exist within a globalized, interconnected world. People serve in the military, earn university degrees, create films, write books, and build businesses, all while maintaining ties to homelands and traditions. Contemporary Apache identity includes rodeos and round dances, social media, and sunrise ceremonies, fluent speakers and learners reclaiming words once nearly lost. The old tension between freedom of movement and imposed borders now plays out in fights over pipelines, mines, and tourism rather than cavalry patrols. But the underlying question is similar. Who gets to decide what happens on Apache land and to Apache bodies? The Apache Nation continues to inspire because its story embodies courage under impossible pressure, strategic intelligence in the face of overwhelming force, and a refusal to surrender the right to define oneself. For many indigenous and non-indigenous people alike, Apache history is a reminder that resistance need not end in erasure, that cultural survival can outlast military defeat, and that even in captivity, identity can be guarded, rebuilt, and passed on. Their legacy challenges simple narratives of conquest and closure, insisting instead on continuity, adaptation, and the possibility of resurgence. And that sets up a final, uncomfortable question for anyone listening to their story today. Now that the truth behind the old myths is visible, what will be done with it? Will it become just another romanticized tale, or a call to actually respect the peoples whose lands, histories, and futures have too long been treated as someone else's backdrop? The Apache legacy endures as a living testament to courage, strategy, and indigenous identity that refuse to break under the weight of 3 empires and centuries of attempted erasure. Their mastery of guerrilla warfare, intimate knowledge of land, and unshakable commitment to autonomy made them some of the most formidable fighters in North American history. But their true strength lay just as much in families who endured captivity, elders who guarded songs and stories, and communities that rebuilt themselves after forced removals and broken treaties. Their story is not simply one of battle. It is one of survival, adaptation, and a continuing insistence on being Apache in a world that repeatedly tried to define them as something else. Understanding the real Apache, beyond myth, beyond cinema, beyond the narrow frame of war, is crucial because it restores them to their full humanity. As thinkers, farmers, artists, parents, spiritual leaders, and citizens of sovereign nations, not just silhouettes on a western horizon. When the stereotype of the wild Apache is replaced by knowledge of their history, it becomes harder to ignore ongoing struggles over land, water, language, and rights. Their past stops being a backdrop for someone else's hero story and becomes a mirror asking what justice and respect should look like now. If you want more stories that go beyond the movie version to the real histories of indigenous nations and other forgotten peoples, subscribe to support this work, leave a like so these voices reach more people, and comment which city you're watching from. Because the Apache story, born in the Red Desert, now speaks to the entire world.